Coincidences happen all the time, but these stand out against the rest. These are the top 15 most creepy and most unusual coincidences of all time. Number 15. The car that predicted a war. The First World War forced countries across the globe to realize that they could no longer exist in their own regions, and that the actions of governments far away would have far-reaching consequences for everyone on Earth. More than 70 million people were directly involved in fighting, which led to the loss of at least 22 million people in what remains to this day one of the bloodiest events on our planet's history. There were many different events that led to increasing hostilities between the main countries involved, but if there was one thing that happened to trigger what was believed at the time to be the war to end all wars, then it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne on the 28th of June 1914. He was traveling by car with his wife through Sarajevo when a 19-year-old gunman, Gavrilo Princip, walked up to them and shot them both in cold blood. The car they were in at the time was stored away and eventually made its way to a museum in Vienna. It was only in 2004 that a British tourist noticed a creepy coincidence on its number plate, which said A111118, and coincidentally has the date of the armistice that ended the war was signed on, the 11th of November 1918. Could it be that the plate actually predicted the end of the hostilities that the assassination of its occupants had begun? Or is it just a creepy coincidence? Number 14. The Curse of the Omen. The release of The Exorcist in 1973 heralded a new era of cinema, where audiences sought out new ways to be shocked and frightened by the events unfolding on screen. So it wasn't long until numerous productions were underway, including that of one of the most notorious films of the genre, The Omen. Released in 1976, it tells the story of an American ambassador whose child dies at birth and replaces him with another baby boy who subsequently turns out to be the Antichrist. It's often cited as one of the scariest movies to have ever been made, but despite the strange events and gruesome deaths that take place in it, perhaps more frightening was what happened behind the scenes. As The Omen has gone down in history as one of the most cursed productions ever, a number of people were injured in stunts that went wrong, including a dog handler who was seriously injured when a Rottweiler bit through his protective clothing, and on 3 separate occasions planes carrying crew were struck by lightning. Most troubling of all, though, were the deaths of 2 crew members. The day after filming the scene with the baboons that attacked Damien and his mother, the trainer responsible for the animals was killed by a tiger, even though the cat wasn't involved in the movie. While it could seem unrelated, there are plenty of people who remain convinced this was the result of the movie's curse. If that's not convincing enough, then there's the story of what happened to one of the special effects supervisors. And then on 5 further occasions, other code words also featured in the publication. The question on everyone's minds was whether this simply was a coincidence or something far more serious, where spies were finding a way to pass information to the enemy. The crossword had been written by the headmaster of a school who often used his pupils, some of whom were involved in the war effort, to help set the puzzles. The headmaster and one of his colleagues was arrested by the British intelligence agency and interrogated at length to find out what they knew. In the end, it was determined that they were innocent and that the particular words had been suggested by one of the pupils who had heard them in passing from military personnel and had no idea of how significant they actually were. Number 12. The Curse of July 4th. On the 4th July 1776, delegates from the 13 colonies of America met at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and ratified the Declaration of Independence, which was a document that detailed how they regarded themselves as independent states from the British Empire, and set the foundations for the USA that we know today. This date will forever be remembered for when the nation first stood on its own 2 feet and was set on a trajectory to become the most powerful and influential country on Earth. But it's also a date that's believed by some to be cursed, particularly for those who were involved in signing the document. In fact, 3 of the 5 founding fathers who would go on to be president ended up dying on the 4th of July. Both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on that date in 1826, which just so happened to be the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. And then James Monroe died on the same date 5 years later at the age of 73. Newspapers at the time were quick to draw the link between the deaths and the date, but no evidence could be found that would explain why they died when they did, apart from it all being an unlikely coincidence. Number 11. Life magazine. Life magazine was once a mainstay of newsstands across America, and after first being published in 1883, it would continue in various forms until it was finally closed down in 2000. Its true heyday began in 1936, however, when it was taken over by Henry Luke, the publisher of Time magazine, and the visionary behind turning Life into a weekly that was full of general interest stories that would become famed for its use of high-quality photography. The first issue of this new format in 1936 featured a photo insert of a doctor holding a baby with the caption, "Life Begins." But little did anyone know that this image would become inextricably entwined with the future of the magazine itself. The child in this picture was George Story, and he would grow up to be a journalist who would, on occasion, write for Life and Time magazine. And in his later life became a city manager, and eventually retired to Hawaii. He died of cardiac arrest on April 4th, 2000, which just happened to be a month after Life's publisher had announced that the magazine would end production with its May issue. As planned, the final publication was delivered to newsstands the following month, and in tribute was titled A Life Ends, and featured a biopic of Story and how it was fitting for the magazine to end alongside the subject of one of its first images all those years ago. Number 10. November 9th. It's hard to believe that as recently as 1989, the Berlin Wall still separated the two halves of the German city, as a long-lasting reminder of the events of the Second World War. Finally, though, it was toppled on the 9th of November that year. But this wasn't the first time that the date held significance in the country's history, and was, in fact, the fifth time that the so-called Day of Fate would be remembered for years to come. The first took place in 1848, and was when Robert Blum, a German Democratic politician and activist, was executed for his involvement in fighting for the freedom of Vienna. 70 years later, during the final days of the First World War in 1918, November the 9th would again be consequential as the day that Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany abdicated from the throne to allow the Social Democrats to announce a new republic before communist forces could take control. Just 5 years after that, November the 9th would be the day of the Beer Hall Putsch, when Adolf Hitler, who was at the time the leader of the National Social German Workers' Party, led a march into Munich in an attempt to take control. It was in quashing this rebellion that Hitler would be imprisoned for 5 years, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, and would lay the foundations for the Nazi Party in the following decade. Finally, and most horrifically, the 9th of November in 1938 was the date of the beginning of the Kristallnacht program, which saw German troops and citizens wage a violent campaign against the Jewish community. They destroyed 267 synagogues, killed at least 91 Jews, and the following day arrested more than 30,000 who were sent to concentration camps. A day that many believe marked the true beginning of the persecution of the Jewish community. With so many important events happening on the same day, it's clear to see why it's become an important date on the calendar, even if it may just be a complete coincidence. Number 9. James Dean's car. James Dean's career was on the rise, but at the age of 24, having only starred in 3 movies for which he was credited, he died in a car crash at the junction of California State Route 46 and State Route 41. He had taken part in several racing events and was on his way to another, but tragically would never make it. He was driving his Porsche 550 Spyder, which he had nicknamed Little Bastard at the time. And despite being damaged beyond recognition in the crash that claimed its owner's life, the car was salvaged and became associated with a curse that is believed to have taken several more lives. It caught on fire while it was being stored in a garage following the incident, and even though it was repaired, several parts were taken to be used to fix vehicles for other customers, and it was these cars that became linked with serious injuries of spectators at racetracks, the deaths of a couple of car owners, and the death of a truck driver. Is it a coincidence that so many incidents happened when parts of that Spyder were present? Or is there truth to the curse? We may never know for sure. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. The painting that predicted Hitler. Franz von Stuck was a celebrated German painter and sculptor who was particularly known for his works that depicted Egyptian mythology. Although he became famous during his lifetime and was awarded the Order of Merit of the Bavarian Crown among other accolades, his work was largely forgotten or perceived as irrelevant following his death in 1928. And it was only several decades later that appreciation began to increase once more. He was often said to be the favorite artist of Adolf Hitler, who himself was a keen painter. But there's a mysterious painting of von Stuck's that could signify a much closer connection between the two, or could just be pure coincidence. In a departure from his usual style, in 1889 he completed a work titled The Wild Chase that features the Germanic god Wotan on horseback as he leads an army of the dead. It's a particularly dark and morbid painting, but if you look closely, you might see a resemblance between the way God looks and Hitler. The problem is, this image was completed the year that Hitler was born. Could it be then that this was a premonition of one of the 20th century's most vile dictators, or did Hitler base his recognizable look after a painting of his favorite artist? Number 7. The My Way killings. Frank Sinatra's My Way immediately became popular when it was released in 1969, and has since become the anthem of anyone looking back on past actions. The baby catcher. Normally, if you heard of a baby catcher, you'd probably call the police, but in 1937, Joseph Figlock, a street sweeper in Detroit, Michigan, became a local hero after saving a young child's life. According from reports at the time, he was walking down the street when a baby fell from the 4th floor above him. It landed on his head and shoulders, which caused significant injuries to the both of them, but importantly, they both survived and went on to make full recoveries. Now, you think the chances of this happening to someone once would be extremely rare. What about twice? The following year, Figlock was clearing trash from a street when a 2-year-old child fell from a window above him and again landed on him. Again, they were both injured, but they both survived and would go on to make a full recovery. Number 3. The Finnish twins. We often hear stories of how closely connected twins are, whether it be their ability to detect when each other is in danger, if they've had some great news, or if they've died. But a story from 2002 suggests that some twins may be far more entwined than anyone had previously realized. In March of that year, a 70-year-old Finnish twin was riding his bicycle in the town of Rahe, which is around 450 miles north of Helsinki, when he was tragically struck by a lorry and was killed instantly. Police attended the scene and tried to contact his next of kin, but when they finally found the number of his brother a few hours later, it was far too late. His twin had been cycling along the same stretch of road, and just 2 hours after his brother had been killed, he too was hit by a lorry and died instantly, just 1 mile away from the earlier accident. Police were adamant that there was no way the second twin could have known what had happened to his brother, and the two events happening like this were a terrible coincidence. Although there are some that believe to this day that the second twin had sensed what had happened and knew it was time to move on as well. Most dangerous vacations. Vacations are a great way to escape the stresses of our lives and take some time to relax and recuperate. But for one couple from the UK, trips away have become somewhat of a nightmare. On September the 11th, 2001, they were vacationing in New York when they were abruptly woken up that morning with the news of the deadliest attack to have ever taken place on US soil. And on July the 7th, 2005, they happened to be in London at the time of the terrorist attacks that killed 52 people on the transport network. Finally, in late 2008, they were on a dream trip to Mumbai at the time of the terrorist killing spree that specifically targeted foreigners. It was an awful coincidence that they managed to be in 3 places that have fallen victim to terrorist attacks in the space of 7 years. And while they could be seen as some of the unluckiest tourists in the world, at least they managed to make it home alive each time. Watch our Obscure playlist for more top 15 videos about the more obscure subjects in our world. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best and most obscure videos.